when you go through something where someone can label you as crazy or insane, you're automatically considered an unreliable narrator. So I knew that if I were to write this through the nonfiction lens, I would be fighting that assumption. And so it made more sense to do this through the lens of fiction, because then, there's far more of an understanding that, well, everyone is, in a sense, an unreliable narrator.
I'm Michael Tamblyn, CEO of Rakuten Kobo. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guest is the Mohawk writer and author, Alicia Elliott, author of an award-winning book of essays, A Mind Spread Out on the Ground, and a new novel, And Then She Fell. It is a story of a young woman named Alice experiencing the stress of new motherhood, feeling isolated in Toronto, which feels far away culturally more than physically from where she grew up on Six Nations, while also trying to carve out time for writing, keeping up appearances as the wife of a rising academic star. Alicia Elliott, welcome to Kobo.
Thanks for having me. It's so good to be here.
So I'll say right now, for the benefit of listeners, yes, there are some heavy, hard themes in this book, and we're going to look and talk about some of them, but it's also a funny book. The longest chapter in this book is called, and I quote, "This is a long one, so get some snacks and get comfortable." and and it is representative in its tone. So I listen with care, but it is absolutely worth sticking with us. I briefly described Alice's situation in the intro just now, and I was hoping you might introduce us to Alice as we find her at the start of And Then She Fell.
So Alice kind of was wrapped up in her own kind of daily dance, I suppose, caring for her mother, who went through an accident. Her father had passed away when she was young, and so she was very used to kind of living a life where she was kind of hoping for something more, but never even, and in some ways not even daring to hope for something more. She was kind of like, I'm living on Six Nations. I'm living with my mom. Like, I'm working at, an under the table job at the bingo hall, and like everything is how it's going to be. And, when she meets her future husband, Steve, everything kind of opens up. There's all these different possibilities that she had never thought that would actually be possible for her, that are now introduced. And so, he has so many things to offer in the traditional sense, the idea that he comes from a very wealthy family. He has a very stable career. He is, yes, he's a white guy, but he is interested in her culture, in Haudenosaunee culture, and he ingratiates himself with her community, and people like him and everything, and including her mother. And so it all feels very good, initially, is this relationship. And in some ways, you could see how kind of Steve's mother, who is worlds away from Six Nations. She's a very wealthy white woman, who can gift her son a house in Toronto, which should give you some indication of how much money she has, and how different their worlds are. So you could see how she would be like, oh, this native girl from the res, you're marrying her. She's like getting so much from this, and someone might think that Steve isn't getting as much in return. But if you were to look at it kind of, I guess, sideways or from another perspective, because Steve is kind of this academic who's involved in all of this, in making Indigenous knowledge his kind of academic niche, he's actually benefiting greatly. Academically, he has now he has a Native wife. When Alice gets pregnant and has their baby, he has now a Native daughter. So in some ways, that kind of solidifies his place in that niche that he's made for himself. And so he goes on, he's going to learn Mohawk, that, you know, they offer at the university, and that's going to be great. But also Alice has never had the opportunity to learn Mohawk. And so, you know, there's these kind of weird things that are at play in their relationship that make it more and more kind of who is actually benefiting here. Because, you know, Alice is being kept away from her community now that she's a mother, and she's by herself in this house in Toronto, in this community where she is coded as other, as less than, even in terms of class, like how she looks when she goes outside. People don't think she belongs there. And so it kind of is this weird, almost like gothic situation, even though it's set in the middle of downtown Toronto, right? Or well, not downtown, but you know, in the city in Toronto.
One of the things that you're so good at in this book is like the unwinding of those different feelings of discomfort that come as you're feeling unwelcome or isolated in a space, and how that can start to change into something that feels more like menace. Because she doesn't just feel, you know, like a fish out of water. It starts to feel threatening for her over time.
Yes. Yes. And I think that that's something that I really wanted to play with, because there is this notion that, you know, so often when someone who is coming from some sort of marginalized identity is being kind of faced with discrimination or something like that, especially there's this very particular kind of Canadian polite discrimination, which has this veneer of respectability. And so so it has that plausible deniability built into it. So you can say, why did you say that to me? And someone would be like, what do you mean? I was just complimenting you on your beautiful hair that I touched without your permission, and was talking about how it was so beautiful. It reminds me of Pocahontas, you know, to give a random kind of example, right? And so, you know, it hides behind this, oh, I was just complimenting you. And so in that sense, there's always this kind of duality of like, was that actually something that was racist and harmful, or was it harmless actually, as they're claiming it was? And I wanted to really kind of play up that duality, that ability to hide intentions. And so in that sense, the reader too is kind of put in this position where it's like, is this something that she should really be worried about, or is she thinking too much about this? And I think that that was something that, you know, when kind of bringing in some of the genre elements, talking about kind of like, so sort of like I was mentioning, the gothic or the horror parts is like, you know, what is real, what is not real, and that kind and what is menacing and what is harmless. And that's the kind of play that's constantly happening around her.
And this, of course, presses not just against what do you hear versus the message that a speaker is delivering, but also gets into questions of, you know, what of your own mind can you trust more broadly. And this book is not autobiography, but it is informed by firsthand experience. To be clear, you are not Alice. Steve, Alice's husband, seems like he is not a representation of your husband, Mike,
No.
who you thank in the acknowledgments. But the way that people treat Alice and how it feels to be her, that is something that you have experience of, both through the experience of your mother's mental illness and then an experience that you yourself had in the summer of 2020. And I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about those parts of your own experience and how they informed this book.
Yeah, for sure. So, you know, I talk a bit about my mother in my first book, which is nonfiction, and her own experience of bipolar disorder with schizophrenic elements, and how I saw that as like throughout my life as a child into adulthood from the outside. And, you know, it always felt very mysterious to me, because my mother would not talk about it with me. She wouldn't talk about the interior way of looking at it and how that experience felt to her. So all I had was kind of this lens that, you know, in many ways society and also my father and all of this misunderstanding or non-understanding of what that experience actually is like on the inside. And so I kind of had that and pushed it onto my mother. So even in writing that piece, it's all still felt very mysterious to me. I still had these unacknowledged biases, I suppose you would call them, about what someone who is in a state of psychosis or mania is like and what you and how you should treat them. And so, there was this notion that, when my mother was manic, you can't believe anything she's saying. She's lying about everything. She's never going to remember any of this anyway. So you can say whatever you want to her or treat her however it's going to be like it's never there when she comes back. And when she would come back, she wouldn't talk about it. So it felt true. And, then as you kind of mentioned, then I was already researching for this book and I had already decided that Alice was going to have postpartum psychosis. And so I was reading in, the summer of 2020, I was reading kind of this research. There's not a lot of research surrounding this particular phenomenon of postpartum psychosis in particular. It's most people know about postpartum depression, but not postpartum anxiety or postpartum psychosis. And so I was doing this research, and things were happening in my personal life that made it so that I was incredibly stressed. And in August of 2020, I had a manic and psychotic episode. They were kind of combined, and then that's when I guess I realized all of the flaws in how I understood that experience to be and what would happen to when you are on the inside of that experience. And so, I saw people, not believing anything I said anymore because they assumed that I was lying about everything. I understood that, people were going to treat me however they wanted without my consent or and assumed that I didn't know any better anyways. And all of these, like, I couldn't make any decisions, that I shouldn't be allowed to make any decisions about my own life because I'm in that state. And like all of these things where, like, people would treat me, I think, in a way that they thought I wasn't going to remember, but I remembered everything that happened. And unfortunately, there's this idea that someone who is in psychosis or mania doesn't understand what's happening in front of them or around them. And that was definitely not the case for me. And for many of the people who I've spoken to who've had that experience, since I've had it, we've had discussions, we understand what's happening around us. We can understand that we can remember it. But it's like the mania and psychosis is on another level layering on top of that. And there is a logic to that we know how to access, and we know we know the reason behind what we're doing and what we're saying and these decisions we're making. Other people don't, and so they assume there is none. And so that's where there's this gap in understanding where people are like, oh, that person doesn't know what they're talking about. And you feel like, no, I do know what I'm talking about, but I'm referring to things that you don't know because you also aren't asking me about it. And you're assuming automatically that I don't know anything. and so there's this, way that is very dehumanizing, and people are assumed to, you know,
Mm-hmm.
not not know anything and all of this. So as I came out of the experience, it kind of was very informative in terms of what that would feel like, and like the interior logic of the psychosis always makes sense to the person who's in psychosis. And so it was important for me to represent that, as well as to represent what are in essence kind of logic gaps in that experience, where you know what you thought was happening,
Mm-hmm.
like on this other layer that was over the top, and sometimes that obscures what was happening in, like, what we would call, I guess, our shared reality. And so there's no way you can go back and know what happened then. So you have this gap in your memory where it's like, I don't know what really happened. I can't explain this. And I wanted to keep that in the book for certain points because I didn't think it was fair if I was writing this experience in a way that was centering the experience of mania and psychosis that Alice and other people have had, that, you know, that readers have that easy understanding of, oh, that's what happened, when Alice herself wouldn't have had that,
Mhm.
and in fact doesn't. So I kind of wanted to kind of slide people in so that they would have a better understanding of how it actually feels when you're in that state, and also how the revelations that come, because there are revelations that happen kind of when you're in that state. I feel like people who've been in drug kind of like states, you know, talk in similar ways about those experiences, that we are expected to just throw them away when they're the result of mania or psychosis. But when people have them on drug trips or whatever, they're like, yeah, that's great, that's so cool, you talk to God. And so it's just like this strange kind of way of still saying anything that happens to us doesn't matter. All of our experiences don't matter. It's this continual dehumanization. And I wanted to fight that by saying there are other experiences. And maybe that isn't, maybe you don't think that matters, but that matters to the person who had it.
You mentioned that you were already in research for this book when you had this episode yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Coming through that experience in 2020, did you think, yes, I want to share this experience that I have had in terms of the story that you were getting ready to write? Were you trying to decide what stays in and what doesn't? How did you process what you wanted to put on the page from what had been a very vivid personal experience?
Well, because I've already written nonfiction, um I know the uses for it. I
Mhm.
know I'm very aware also of how nonfiction operates in terms of, you know, um you having, like, when you're writing nonfiction, you kind of have to have, it's very dependent on the reader trusting you as a narrator of your story. And when you go through something where someone can label you as crazy or insane, you're automatically considered an unreliable narrator. So I knew that if I were to write this through the nonfiction lens, I would be automatically fighting that assumption. And so it made more sense to do this through the lens of fiction, because then, you know, there already is, there's far more of an understanding that, well, everyone is in a sense an unreliable narrator, but also that that is just something that is accepted in fiction as true. Whereas there's this idea in nonfiction that you have to be a reliable narrator, whatever that means. And, you know, and everything you say has to be truthful, or else, you know, your story is not valued.
Mhm.
And so, you know, bearing that in mind when I was writing this as fiction, and I was already planning on writing it, but I feel like I came to it after that with kind of like a renewed vigor intellectually in terms of what I was trying to do. And I knew that I wasn't going to include pretty much like nothing that happened to me, or
Mhm.
and none of my nothing that happened to me, or none of my, you know, delusions or hallucinations or anything like that appear in the book. They're totally Alice's, and they have to be Alice's because her situation is so very um particular, and so
Mhm.
it has to be hers. And so I was able to, what I was able to do is take that understanding of how often what's happening in terms of your delusions or your psychosis is very much informed by what's happening around you. So there is this interplay, and I was able to kind of take that understanding and then apply it to Alice and her situation, so that it made sense that, like, oh yes, of course she's already having these feelings that she's isolated in this community. So like when, you know, she starts to hear the houses talking to her saying you don't belong here, it feels very like, it makes sense that she
Mhm.
would think that because she is already feeling that. And so it's kind of like those thoughts are informing this other layer of reality that's over the top.
So let's go back a little bit because you mentioned this was a project that you already had underway, that you had started research on this. Was this the book that you thought you would be writing when you kicked it off, or did you have a different idea in mind altogether at the beginning?
I don't mean to laugh. It's just kind of funny because it's like gone through so many iterations at this point. Um,
It was originally a children's book and it was about cars.
yes, exactly.
Right. Okay.
It was originally a short story that I wrote when I was like I want to say I was 19, maybe 20. And so it was so I had my son when I was 17. I got pregnant with him. I was 18 when I had him. And then I went to university like immediately. And I was with him for a month, and then, I would come home every weekend to be with him, and in between I was like every 4 hours I was in my dorm room pumping breast milk to bring home to him. And so it was very disorienting and alienating. And I felt like, also, even despite having, like, I had a midwife, I had a doula, I had people around me who were very familiar with the process of giving birth and what happens to your body. And yet I still felt like, in some ways, I had been lied to about what that experience entails. And so, even just like physically, in terms of how your body changes after you have a baby in these ways you don't realize. And so, it was something that when I wanted to write a short story, it occurred to me I wanted to write about that. I wanted to write about those ways in which we are surprised by this experience of motherhood, because you can never be totally prepared for it. But also, I feel like we could be a little bit more prepared for it if people were a little bit more honest about kind of what you're facing. And so it was very much about that initially. And then, it kind of went from there, because I also I feel like in some ways I was lying to myself about the kind of writer I was, because I was like, oh, we have to write literary works. We have to write, you can't, it has to be all very realism, literary realism, and all of that. And that had never been what I loved reading the most. I loved reading stuff that was a little bit weirder, that was kind of experimenting with things, that was maybe kind of flirting with like dark themes and stuff like that. And so it took me a while to figure that out, and that I was like lying to myself. But then once I did, I was like, okay, how can I combine these, or like what can I do with this? Because it was a story that was kind of out of control, and like it was too long to be a short story. I was like, should I make this a novella? Like, what should I do? And this is, they always say, like, hold on to all of your drafts. You never know what you're going to do with them. But there was another short story I had written that had never clicked. And I realized that, like, the character was the same, from like, so the prologue is basically that short story, which is Alice kind of as a young person, and what happens that you need to know before everything happens when she's a mother in Toronto, and that past kind of gets drawn back up, essentially. So it was like it went through many different iterations as I was trying to figure these things out. And bringing in different genre elements like horror, and, like, I guess in some ways, I don't know about sci-fi, but like fantastical elements, I
Mhm.
suppose. That all just was like fun for me. I wanted it to be like fun in some ways, like we have these books that, yes, we can tackle serious subjects, but we can also have fun. We can have humor, we can have lightness in certain moments, and I kind of wanted to have that. And so, yeah, it just allowed me to do that in ways that I don't think, if I was trying to, be literary fiction realism, then it wouldn't have worked.
And one of the things I love is that where the weird stuff comes in is also often where the funny bits show up. You have this kind of sarcastic chorus extra narrator who seems to be writing the chapter titles. And there's also a cockroach who seems to have very low job satisfaction about its role of providing spiritual guidance. And so was that just you finding the tones um and the kind of the accents that made it feel like a book that you were going to love?
Yeah, it was very much that. I wanted to like there was stuff that surprised me, and that's always the fun I think in writing is when, you think you know what's going to happen and then all of a sudden here comes this cockroach and you're like, "Hey, okay, what do you have to say?" And all of a sudden now you're thinking of what the culture of and history of the cockroach is throughout time and how long they've been alive and all of this stuff, right? And wanting to have this unassuming figure that everyone kind of cringes at and hates, is like the cockroach in Toronto. You're like, oh God. you know and having this like having fun with it, I guess. That's the fun part is all of the weird stuff. And so that was the stuff that kept me interested because I get very bored very easily. And I have like a terrible attention span. So I have to be continually surprising myself to keep myself interested. And that's how I like my books to be when I read them is I want them to be books that something weird happened. You're like, wait, what? And so you keep reading and are like, where's this going? And so I wanted to really kind of create that kind of effect, but also, obviously in editing, I was very mindful of how all of the threads came together in a way
Mhm.
where it was surprising, but also it makes sense if you go back and reread.
Yeah.
So,
We'll come back to Alice, but I wanted to ask you about Steve, her husband, whose job has taken them to Toronto, where he's an academic chasing tenure. Can you tell us a bit about him?
yeah. So in the very earliest drafts, I didn't know what I wanted his job to be. It was kind of just whatever. But as I was writing, and I was clearer about that this was going to be a book. I really started thinking a lot about Haudenosaunee culture, and that is what Alice is trying to write. Is she's trying to write of her own version of the Haudenosaunee creation story of Sky Woman and everything. And so when I was kind of doing that research, which there's so many different versions of the story, and so I was doing all of this research. I happened to come across Rick Montour's book. He is, a knowledge keeper and a language teacher on my res, and he's done a lot of research into the writings coming from Six Nations. And I remember reading in his book "We Share Our Matters" this that he was talking about how basically academics coming and studying our people, which they called us the Iroquois. We were that was kind of like the foundation for U.S. anthropology was this studying, and there would be so many academics who were coming and studying us, and then they were taking their findings and going and publishing and creating these great careers for themselves, creating a field of study where they had all of this power and we had none in terms of how our culture was represented, how it was understood, and what was happening with it. And so that was something that really struck me, in particular because I've had a lot of experience with academics and not just white academics. There's something about the academy that requires you to kind of keep everything at a distance and keep your community at a distance and theorize about these abstract things. And we're all talking about these abstract things with these long words that only we understand. And so the communities that we're theorizing about therefore can't actually engage in the conversation and speak back. And so there's been this long history of that with my community. And so I thought it made perfect sense for Steve to be someone who was engaging in that same behavior today, doing it through the lens of, oh well, he's consulting her mom and he gives her credit and he pays her for her knowledge, but at the end of the day, his name is still the name on the book, on the thesis, and he's the one who gets the credit for publishing knowledge that hasn't been published before about indigenous. He was looking into planting and everything. And so the seed keeping knowledge and stuff like that is no longer just for our people, it's for other people to look at and to use for whatever they want. And I think that that play between the academy and studying groups of people that especially there's this notion that we're a dying race, or you know what I mean, like we have to study these people before they're dead and then keep knowledge about them in weird ways. There's still like, you know, even going to the level of museums, there's still like museums that hold, you know, bodies of people who were colonized inside their museums that they refuse to give back. And so, you know, there's this long history of when we think about colonization, we generally think about land, and that is true. But also there is this stealing of information, the stealing of bodies, the stealing of culture and all of and language in all of these ways. And it's to keep it and hoard it, you know, and not to have it for people to access who still need it in those communities that you're kind of pilfering from. So yeah, I thought that that made the most sense for Steve. And you know, he I think he means well, but he also doesn't understand totally the history that he's entombed in, and how he's kind of um how he's recreating these same problems, I suppose, that he thinks that he's helping to solve.
And he's a climber. He's he's on the hunt for tenure, and he's a very much a part of that world of academia where
Mhm.
everything has the potential to count on that application for the next rung in your career. And how easy it is, if you're Alice, to see everything as just an accumulation of that social credit score, including her child, including all of the knowledge that her family's provided to him. It's easy to see that as a like a it's essentially a vacuum cleaner of of cultural value.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that is where when you're really feeling very paranoid and stuff like that, you clutch onto those things, right? Where you're like, does this person really care about me? Or what am I to them, you know? And that you start to dissect those things. And I think that that happens a lot when, especially, you know, we're already depressed about the situation we're in. We feel like we can't talk to our partner. Our partner is seeming like they're doing great, and they don't seem to care about what's happening with us. So I think that that's, you know, something that you need. Everyone has those, I think, things that they can clutch on to. And you know, whether you think that, you know, I leave it to the reader to kind of interpret Steve as they see fit, because I didn't want to have him be this like cartoonish villain. Although I think depending on how you read him, you can think that he's very villainous, or you can think that he's kind of just like he's engaging in that kind of we were kind of talking about before, that this plausible deniability of like, oh, I meant well, you know, and what does that mean when you mean well and the actions are still ultimately creating problems? You know, where is that line between intention and effect? And does that intention matter if the effect is still the same?
And it's a balancing act that occurs throughout the book. You have Steve's actions, you have Alice's inner monologue, interpreting and reinterpreting those actions, and then there's you as the reader going, well, maybe he's fine, or maybe he isn't, um, or seeing Alice, hearing characters speaking about her, or maybe about her, intuiting contempt and passive aggression, which often turns out to be accurate. Let's be clear. And what's constant isn't that Alice is wrong or crazy, but that she's suffering.
Yes.
That sometimes it's magnified or it's changed by what's going on with her mentally, based on how she's taking things here, but the suffering is real.
Mm.
And so were you mindful of tipping the reader one way or the other between sympathy or lack of sympathy, both for Steve and for Alice, as you were as you were setting up this series of balancing acts?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of make it so that you could understand what how someone could see both Alice and Steve as both, as likable, but also as flawed. I wanted their flaws to be not something that was hidden, but something that was apparent. And so, in that sense, that's always for me what creates realistic characters is yes, sure, they can be likable or they can be unlikable, but there has to be some sense of duality there because no one is all one thing or the other. There's always like a blend of the two. And so, Steve can be in one scene really kind with her, really great with Dawn. And you can see how, if those are the moments that are in your mind, you can think, oh, wow, he's a great father, he's a great dad. And then you see kind of these situations where maybe he's under stress and he says something in the heat of the moment that's harmful. And I feel like that's also very realistic to how we all kind of operate. When everything is great, of course it's fine, to we're going to be our best versions of ourselves. But when all of a sudden there's these other things that are piling up in the background where a situation is going to have more significance, like, in the book, Steve has put a lot of pressure on himself and on Alice for this dinner party because it's leading up to tenure. So you have to make sure that, everything is all in place. And so then when she doesn't act in a way that he wants her to, or he thinks she should, then all of a sudden he will snap. And I think that those are things that are how we all kind of act. And it's the same with Alice, she gets upset when things are like when she's very stressed as well. And then all of a sudden she says something. And that's kind of I wanted to be very mindful that it wasn't all going to be one way or the other. So you could
Mm-hmm.
look back and you could say, okay, well, yes, yes, Alice is right in these instances, but maybe she's being a little harsh in this instance. And, maybe, Steve is being an asshole in this instance, but he's also pretty nice to her and sweet to her in these instances. So I wanted there to be both.
Alice is the daughter of a storyteller, and has taken on some of that role herself. She's decided and then promised to write a new telling of the Haudenosaunee creation story of Sky Woman. But she has questions and doubts about her own abilities. Her father was a gifted storyteller. Those stories came to her through him, but the doubt and the uncertainty about passing them on is almost crippling to her. I don't know any writer who has not hit that wall at one time or another, but how much bigger are the stakes when we're talking about the stories that are core to a people's sense of the world and their place in it? And was that something that you wanted to try and capture?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that, kind of going back to the earlier conversation, with Rick Montour kind of talking about how all our culture has such a history of being narrated by people who are not us. That means that, when that happens to people, to an identifiable group of people, then they are very, very much more aware than other people of the weight of representation and of what that means in terms of how other people see you, understand you, respect you, or don't, and or think they know everything. And then, if that's all false information that they're using, then you have to deal with the ramifications. Your community has to deal with the ramifications of that negative perspective or stereotype that's placed upon you. And so, as I was writing it, I was grappling with the same questions Alice is. I was like, oh man, is this going to be like I'm writing about this? My community is very, very vocal. So like, if they don't like this, they're going to be mad. And so, I think that, when you're coming from a community that knows these stories and cares about these stories and knows how much that reflects our perspective, our culture, our history, um, I think for me, it was because it was like that was occurring to me, it made sense that that would also occur to Alice. Especially as someone who knows that, also storytelling is, often men are the ones who are taking that on. And so, okay, if I'm telling this as an Indigenous woman, I want to make sure that, that is reflected and represented properly when you're talking about Sky Woman and what happened with her, where you're going to have different understandings of her than a man would, and so especially her as a pregnant woman who is then falling to earth. So, I really wanted to be very open about that and have people considering it, because this is also like you said, this is something that all writers kind of grapple with is, and maybe it's not always necessarily about representing a specific culture, but it is about telling a story and knowing the weight of words and the responsibility you have in putting those words together in a particular way so that people who read it understand it, hopefully in the way that you intend them to.
Much to Alice's annoyance, Steve has a gift for learning Mohawk. As you said earlier, he's studying it, he's taking classes in it. And there's a part where she's thinking about how casually he speaks this language that was nearly extinguished. And you pick up on this point of tension that it's just a language to him, but is central and sacred to Alice. But she also gets that the language needs to be used and be just a language in order to thrive. Is that tension between something sacred and precious on one hand and something that should be out in the world, kind of getting dirt on it? Is that something that that you've landed on one side or the other of?
I think that when something is still rare and there's still this lack of common knowledge, for example, of the language, then that means that, of course, understanding and knowing it is going to mean more. Whereas if a lot of people know it, then, someone saying a word wrong or something doesn't mean as much. It doesn't, it's not as big of a deal. And so I think it's always, for me, it's always a matter of that. Like, I would love if Mohawk became a language that, so many people knew that it was just casual. And in that case, then it really wouldn't matter one way or the other. We could all speak Mohawk, that would be great. But we're not at that point yet. And so, even thinking about like real life, not to be put too fine a point on it, but the Minister of Indigenous Services right now is a man named Mark Miller who learned Mohawk. And he spoke Mohawk in Parliament before he was appointed to this position. And he learned from my community. And so great, he learned from our community that leveraged him into a very powerful position in government that he did not have before. And yet, what has he done to help with our language? He hasn't made any serious effort to make it so that our Mohawk language programs are not still fighting for every single dollar, where we don't have enough funding to make sure that the people who want to learn, all of them are funded to learn in any given year. Because it's a very, very time consuming language to learn. Like, you have to be there every day from like 9 to 3 or 4, Monday to Friday for years to get to a point where you can converse in Mohawk in a comfortable way and have some degree of fluency. And so, that means that you can't really hold a job in a typical way if you're trying to do that. So we then need funding to make it so that adults who are trying to learn this and pass this on to their kids have that funding. We don't have that funding. Mark Miller has the ability to, he benefited from that. So
Mm-hmm.
now what's he doing with that? And that's where I always come back to is like, what are you doing with that now? And
Right.
are you going to give back to the communities that helped you? Because he didn't learn that by himself. He learned that through teachers. He learned that in a classroom with people who helped talk with him so that he could understand better. And that's where I always come back to is, yes, of course, I would love if a whole bunch of people knew Mohawk, but we're not at that point yet. So the people who are learning it, especially people who are coming from outside the culture, need to also, I think, be aware of their own responsibility to then help us so that we
Mhm.
can have more people, especially our own people, but more people in general, knowing our language by having that funding. And, so it kind of is complex in that way, but also not that complex.
There is an essay in your book, Mind Spread Out on the Ground, called Dark Matter. And it is an elegant mirroring of research into dark matter in the universe, which is theorized around effects it has, even though it can't be seen, and the effects of racism, which can be clearly seen, even if it's harder to get people to see the racism, like the act itself. Do you feel like in this move from nonfiction into fiction and bringing these characters forward that you got closer to showing the shape of some of those effects by bringing this story into view?
I hope so. It's always hard to gauge, what whether you accomplish what you set out to accomplish. Really, the only way to tell is by, is having readers read it and then tell you what they think. So, I think that that's something I hope for. But it also is, it's dependent on the reader, and I am thankful for anyone who reads the work, however they engage with it. That's always going to be a gift. You always hope that, people will take from it what you wanted them to take from it, but there's so little you can do once it's published, it's out there. So, I mean, I did my best while I was writing to make it so that that was there and something that people could take away. But, uh, for me personally, especially when I'm reading fiction, I also want that entertainment element, right? And I think that that also, in some ways, is a great way to kind of get that education piece in through entertainment. So I was really hoping that the book would be entertaining and page turning in a way that was, you know, um, yes, had that education element and had that element of like, trying to have people see these things that maybe they wouldn't see, but in a way that felt like exciting and
Hmm.
interesting, and it didn't feel so much like you're sitting down and like, okay, here's what we're teaching today. I didn't want that.
Now let's have a chapter of exposition on.
Yes. Exactly. So
You talked earlier about how much more easily fiction can encompass some of these issues, like mental illness. Narrators don't have to be objectively reliable. Perception and perspective can be slippery. And as you were getting ready for this book, were there other authors or storytellers you were looking to who you felt handled this really well, um, who let you see different ways that fiction could give us at least a glimpse of what was going on inside a person's head?
hmm. Yeah, so I'm someone who does a lot of research when I'm writing, and so I will read anything that I find that is somewhat related in terms of content.
Are you one of those people who loves the research part? Like,
It's I do it to the point where it becomes a problem, and that it's like I need to put it down because I need to actually write. But what was fun with this was I wanted to see how other writers had portrayed psychosis and things like that in fiction. And there is a book called The Faces by Tove Ditlevsen, and it's about a mother who kind of has this falls into psychosis, and then she's in a mental hospital and then she comes out. And that was a great book. And especially like in, later in the book, there's like an element of faces that I thought was an interesting mirror, because I had already had that kind of idea, and I was like, oh, this is so perfect. And so seeing how she kind of did that was great. And then even in terms of not necessarily the same content, but tone. I love Eden Robinson's work, and particularly the Trickster series, where she was dealing with, you know, very modern indigenous like characters who were kind of struggling with these ancient kind of um monsters, or different magical beings.
They all have a gods and monsters problem.
Yes, exactly. And her tone, I love her tone and all of her work. And so, I'm always very mindful of how she writes, and I get a lot of inspiration from her because she just does it so well. She's so funny, she's so clever, and yeah, I just like I can't say enough good things about her writing. She's just brilliant. So she was someone who I also kind of pulled from. And then in terms of like the element of wonder, I always kind of turn to Heather O'Neill. And even though we're not writing about the same things, she has there's just this element of, like I said, wonder to all of her work that makes you just like feel like everything is just a little bit more magical, I suppose. Even when she's talking about something that's happening in the 1800s in like the poorest part of Montreal. And I think that element is something that I kind of really admire in her work and hope that I can kind of use to whatever effect I want to use it to in my work. So yeah, different elements, different things I kind of pick and pull from whoever.
You've referenced Gothic fiction a couple of times as we've been talking, and you wrote a few years ago about the rise of horror writing by Indigenous authors. And since then, we've seen Stephen Graham Jones being reviewed in mainstream publications, and Jessica John's Bad Cree was a big hit this year. We just had Wab Rice on the show talking about Moon of the Crusted Snow and its sequel. And so do you feel like, horror is a place that you might want to hang out in for a while as a fiction author?
Yes. I already have my ideas for the next time, and I just feel like it's going to be much like this book's already kind of weird, but this one's going to be weird and maybe a little bit more graphic. So I'm already having like fun and also like gagging and like the possibilities. So which for me is fun. I mean, I love horror, so that's something that I personally enjoy. But yes, like, fair warning, it will get weird and creepy and gross. So
You heard it here first. Alicia, thank you so much for joining us.
thank you so much for having me.
I've been speaking with Alicia Elliott, author of And Then She Fell. Find it and all of the books we've spoken about at Kobo and Conversation's home on the web, kobo.com/conversation. Check the show notes for a link. Subscribe in your podcast player to catch every episode. And if you enjoyed this one, share it with someone who makes you feel heard when you most need it. Kobo and Conversation is produced by Nathan Maharaj and hosted by me, Michael Tamblyn. Thank you for listening.